Okay, so now we can move on to the second half of section 4 of chapter 6, and we can go to the microscopic anatomy. What we're focused on here really is the cells that make up bone tissue. So we have five basic cell types right here. They all have a slightly different function, and they all originate from the same osteoprogenitor cell, with the exception of one, which is your osteoclast, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But what the big picture is here is that our bones are basically calcium storage banks. So we're constantly breaking down the bone or resorbing the bone. And when we have too little calcium and we have too much calcium, we're going to deposit that calcium into the bone. So we're going through constantly bone reabsorption and bone deposition, and that's what we call bone remodeling. And in order to remodel bone, all five of these cells play a role. So let's start with osteogenic cells. They're also called osteoprogenitor cells. So they're basically your bone stem cells. And when we talked about the two membranes that are found within bone, this was the cell that we could find in each one of those membranes. It is mitotically active, one of two cells that is, meaning that it can undergo division. And when it does, some of the cells do stay as osteogenic stem cells, but others can differentiate into what are called osteoblasts. So that's going to move us to our second type of cell, which are osteoblasts. And osteoblasts build bone. So do I have that here? So they're bone forming cells, or they're helping build the bone. How do they help build osseous tissue? Is that they secrete the osteoid. What is the osteoid? It's the matrix. So it's made up of collagen, and we have some fibers. We have some calcium binding proteins. Collagen is the bulk though. Osteoblasts are also mitotic, so they're able to undergo cellular division. And when they do, they just differentiate into more osteoblasts themselves. So here we can see, here's our osteoprogenitor cell, which is our bone stem cell. It can undergo mitosis. Some can remain osteoprogenitor cells, but some can become osteoblasts, which are going to help build the bone by synthesizing the matrix. We have our third type of cell, which are osteocytes. And if you remember, blasts are what we call immature. Let me go back up. If you see blast, this is the immature form of a cell. So when we talked about cartilage, if we have a chondrocyte, that would be the immature form. When we get to a mature cell, its suffix is cyte. So that just means mature. So osteocytes are mature bone cells. How do we get osteocytes? Basically, our osteoblasts are going to turn into osteocytes. When does this happen? Well, as our osteoblasts are secreting the matrix, or the osteoid, they're eventually going to become completely surrounded by the osteoid, at which point they're going to become an osteocyte. And the space in which they reside is the lacunae. Once they're in the lacunae and they're an osteocyte, they can no longer divide. So we only really had two types of cells that could divide, and that was our osteoblasts and our osteoprogenitor cells. What is their function? To help maintain the matrix. So they secrete osteoid when they need to, and they don't when they don't. And how do they know when to do this? When we have certain stimuli acting upon them. So if we have extra force or even weightlessness, that's going to modify what they're doing at that point in time. And there is some form of communication, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that tells osteocytes when to secrete the matrix and when not to. Okay, our fourth type of cell is a bone lining cell. The most important thing here is really that they do the same thing as an osteocyte. So they help maintain the matrix. Don't worry about these two terms. And again, if you look here, it's believed. So they think that's what these bone lining cells do, but they're not entirely sure. For the sake of exam, they basically have the same function as an osteocyte in maintaining the matrix. So our fifth cell is an osteoclast. So we have talked about all the cells that help secrete and maintain the bone matrix, but we haven't talked about the one that actually functions in bone reabsorption or bone breakdown, and that would be our osteoclast. And they are derived from a completely different cell line than all the other four bone cells that we talked about before. They're actually derived from cells that become macrophages. So a macrophage is derived from a monocyte, and a monocyte is a type of white blood cell or a leukocyte. So these are actually derived from a white blood cell line and not an osteoprogenitor cell. But if you know the function of a macrophage, it's basically to engulf something, some sort of foreign debris, and basically ingest it and break it down into components. Well, that's what we want if we're talking about an osteoclast because we're trying to break down bone. So it makes sense that it comes from this white blood cell line. So they are huge cells, and again, they function in bone reabsorption or bone breakdown. Because they're going in and they're using a lot of energy and a lot of things to break down this bone, they do have multiple nuclei. They also have what are called ruffled borders. So the edges are actually ruffled. Anytime you have a ruffled border or any type of extension like microvilli or something like that, the whole purpose of doing that is to increase your surface area because the enzymes needed to break down the bone, they're on the surface of these cells. So if we have ruffled borders and all the enzymes are along this way, that means we can break down more bone compared to if we just had a surface that was flat or even circular, we wouldn't be able to have as much surface area with the enzymes to break down the bone. So here's just another image. Missing over here is our osteoprogenitor cell, which could differentiate into an osteoblast, which is just the immature form of a bone cell. It's responsible for synthesizing matrix. Once the osteoblast secretes basically the matrix or the osteoid around its entire circumference, it's then going to become an osteocyte or the mature bone cell, at which point it's just going to help maintain the matrix, not actually synthesize it, but make sure everything's ready. And then we have our osteoclast, and if you look up here, it's derived from a completely different cell line. It's derived from our white blood cell line, and its function is in bone reabsorption or bone breakdown. So those are our cells. Let's go on to some of our structures. We have different structures if we're talking about compact bone or spongy bone. So if we're talking about compact bone, we can also call that lamellar bone, and you'll see why in a little bit. But what does it consist of? What are some of its structures? We have the osteon, canals, canuliculi, and different types of lamellae that I'm about to go into. So the osteon is probably one of the most important structures to know about compact bone because it is the structural unit of compact bone. And what are they? These are cylinders basically running parallel to the long axis of long bones, and these cylinders act as weight-bearing pillars. So when we talk about compact bone, is made up of multiple osteons, and I'll show you a picture on in a little bit. And each osteon is further made of what we call lamellae. And these are just rings of collagen fibers, and these collagen fibers run in different directions to help withstand stress and resisting twisting forces and things like that. Also, between the collagen fibers are what we can find some bone salts. So here's a picture. If we were to take compact crushed bone and look at it in a microscope, this is what we would see right here. So this is an osteon. It looks like we took a tree and cut it in half when we're looking at a tree trunk. But we can see compact bone. We have a bunch of different osteons. Here's another one, and possibly one over here. So one osteon, which again is our structural unit of compact bone, in the center we see a hole, and this hole is the central or reversion canal. Each osteon is made up of lamellae rings. So here's a ring, here's another ring, here's another ring. Each ring within the osteon is a lamellae. We can also see in this picture these dark little, which I'm coloring over, oval little spaces. Those are the lacunae in which our osteocytes are going to reside. If we took this osteon right here and pulled each one of those rings up, this is the image we would get over here. So each one of the rings or lamellae are shown here, each one successively pulled up a little bit higher. And what the point is here is that they're made up of collagen fibers. So these gray lines are your collagen fibers. And in one lamellae ring, we have them running this direction. And in the adjacent lamellae rings, we have them running in a different direction. So over here, this is again in a different direction than the other lamellae. This is important because if all of our collagen fibers in each lamella ran in the same direction, we could easily snap our bone if we went in that direction. So having the collagen fibers run in alternating directions in adjacent lamellae really helps us resist some of the stresses and the twisting forces that we put on our bones all the time. Also, we can see the center right here, so that would be this area right here, and that's our central canal or our Haversian canal, whose function is to basically carry our blood supply, our arteries and veins, as well as nerves. Other structures when we're talking about compact bone, we already talked about the central Haversian canal that carries the blood vessels and the nerve fibers, but we have these perforating or Volkmann canals. That run horizontally or at right angles to the central canal. And they're also going to help connect blood vessels and nerves from the periosteum to our medullary cavity and our central canal. So perforating or Volkmann's canals, they run horizontally through the long bone, and then central or Haversian canals run parallel to it. Lacunae we've already talked about. I showed you a little bit of the structures, and basically their function is just a space in which the osteocyte or mature bone cell resides. We also have these things called canuliculi, and they're like hair-like extensions off of the lacunae. They're not really hairs, they're actually canals, because all of our lacunae are interconnected by these canuliculi, these canals. And the function of that is if we have a osteocyte that's residing in a lacunae and its job is to help maintain the matrix, how does it know when to do that? Well, especially because it's isolated in lacunae. We get chemical signals sent through these canuliculi or the canals that are connecting the lacunae so that the osteocytes know when to secrete osteoid and help maintain it or when not to. So they actually have a really important function. And I think I already talked about everything else. So let's go on. We talked a little bit about the lamellae that make up the rings within each osteon, but we also have two other types of lamellae called interstitial lamellae and circumferential lamellae. So I'm going to move on to the next picture to show you what these are. So again, structural unit of bone is an osteon. There is an osteon. Here's another osteon. We have a ton of osteons that make up compact bone. In the center of each osteon, we see our central canal, which carries our blood supply and our nerves. And within each osteon, we can see the lamellae or the rings. So the ones that make up the osteon themselves, we just call lamellae. The other two types of lamellae that we have are what we call interstitial lamellae. So in between these osteons, we can see these other lines right here. They're not complete. They're not making up true osteons. These are what we call interstitial lamellae. We also see these lines going around the entire circumference of the bone. So this is only a section of bone. But if we imagine the entire line going all the way around, we would have these other lamellae going around the entire circumference of the bone. And that's what we call circumferential lamellae. So regular lamellae, just plain lamellae, make up the osteon. Ones that are incomplete, residing between the different osteons, we call interstitial lamellae. Ones going around the entire circumference of the bone, we call circumferential lamellae. Oh, down here, I'm glad I saw this. These little lines right here extending off of each lamellae and all of the lacunae, these are the canuliculi or the canals that allow the chondrocytes within the lacunae to communicate. And if you look closely, this is a lacunae. That purple dot in the center would be your osteocyte. This is just a picture of a bone model, which you need to know for lab, but I did a separate video series on the bone model and some of the bone markings. So reference that video for identification of the structures. So everything we talked about with an osteon, the lamellar rings, circumferential lamellae, all of that, Haversian canal, central canal, all of that has to do with compact bone. So spongy bone's a little bit different. It's not very organized. We don't have a defined medullary cavity like we talked about. Instead, we have these trabeculae, these bone spicules that basically make it up. So we don't have osteons, like I said. We do have the trabeculae. We do have some lamellae, but they're not arranged in rings or nice and neat, so irregularly arranged. And we do have osteocytes interconnected by canuliculi. However, you cannot see them clearly in lab under the microscope or on the bone model where we can see parts of it. And also we do have capillaries that are innervating that area, providing it some blood supply as well. So here again, here's just a picture to remind you, we don't have a medullary cavity. If we zoom in and look at a microscope, this is what we see. We don't see any osteons. We don't see a central canal. We don't see any of that. So spongy bone composition is not as neatly organized as compact bone. The last thing we need to talk about is the chemical composition of bone. Bone is made up of what we call organic components and inorganic components. So we'll talk about the organic components first, and these are what we consider the soft components. And their whole function is to help resist tension. So if we're talking about the soft components, that would include all of our 5 types of cells that we can find in bone, right here, as well as our matrix or our osteoid. Another thing to think about because the organic components help resist tension, how do they do this? They have these bonds that we refer to as sacrificial bonds that are between the stretch along these sacrificial bonds or even possibly breaking them. They can dissipate the energy so we can actually prevent fractures in our osseous tissues, and we can just have these breaks in our collagen fibers instead. So they can go in and reform if we don't have any additional trauma. The inorganic components are a little bit different. These are what we consider your hard components. So they're going to help resist compression, not tension. And what are they? There are salts. So I mentioned before that we can find all these different minerals or these salts between the collagen fibers. That's basically what we're talking about. And these are called hydroxyapatites. If we're talking about our bone mass, they make up about 65%. And they're in or around collagen fibers right there. The whole function of these inorganic hard components is responsible, like I said, for the hardness and resisting compression. So fun fact, bone is half as strong as steel in resisting compression, but if we're talking about resisting tension, it is as strong as steel.